Hey everyone, today we are at historic old Fort Sumner Cemetery, and behind me is the final resting place of Billy the Kid. Or is it? So Billy the Kid's grave is located in the old Fort Sumner Cemetery. And the interesting thing is there used to be a museum right here. You can still see photos or paintings, I guess I could say, of different characters related to it. Like that's Billy the Kid there, and it'll tell you the grave of Billy the Kid. And this used to be a museum that was open, and behind here they have the actual cemetery where Billy the Kid was buried. This museum right here is more in town of Fort Sumner, and it has a replica of the marker. And the reason why they have a replica is because this marker in this cemetery was stolen about 3 times, and the cemetery was not taken care of before like this museum came about. So they have a replica marker, but they were kind of feuding museums, and so that museum even says that this may not be the original marker, that maybe no one really knows where he is buried inside the cemetery. So it is kind of a interesting topic as far as where he's at in the cemetery. But there's Pat Garrett. Here we have Wyatt Earp, Calamity Jane, Old Man Clanton, Doc Holliday, and Wes Harden. It's pretty interesting how they have built this old western thing up. I love these posts that are here, kind of this old west porch here. Would have been neat if they created the board planks here, but it would have been a lot of maintenance for a small area like this. Right here on the way to the cemetery, there's a couple others. Not sure who that is. I'll have to research. Barboncito, Gondo Mucho, Chief Manuelito, and then Raymond Nakai, if I'm saying that right. Those are ones I'd have to research. I really don't know. So this is Billy the Kid's elusive tombstone. And you may be asking yourself, why is there a cage around it? Well, he's such a popular outlaw that his tombstone has been stolen about 3 times. Here it states Billy the Kid's tombstone was stolen in 1951. Its location was a mystery for 26 years until 1976, when it was recovered in Granbury, Texas by Joe Bolin. And Granbury, Texas has another guy that's buried there that claims to have been Jesse James, which they've found otherwise that he's not. But it's kind of maybe a draw to get people in Granbury, or is what they were maybe thinking. Who knows? But the tombstone was stolen again February 8th, 1981, and recovered 4 days later in Huntington Beach, California. Governor Bruce King arranged for a Dabaca County Sheriff Big Jim McBride to fly to Los Angeles and retrieve the marker. Can you imagine the cost of flying on an airplane, shipping that back, all that stuff, just hauling it back, whatever they did? Chamber officials, along with Jarvis P. Garrett, officially reset the tombstone in iron shackles at Billy's feet on May 30th, 1981, the old Fort Sumner Museum. So this is pretty interesting. They've got this whole jail cell. So it's interesting because he wasn't alive very long, but here he is in prison forever inside this makeshift jail like this. Even in death, he's still in prison. That's very interesting. It says, Truth in History, Billy the Kid, born November 23rd, 1860, killed July 14th, 1881. The boy, Bandit King, he died as he lived. So it's interesting, they have this even locked down there, and it looks like maybe a few people have been chipping off of that, which is pretty common. Kind of makes you wonder why they didn't inset that more. This back here, you can certainly see chipping off of that all over the place there, which could be from it just getting stolen and moved, but odds are that people have chipped stuff off. You can actually kind of see little pieces down on the ground here where it's been broken off and people have tried to retrieve it. This is supposedly Billy the Kid's final resting place on this side where this marker is. And these are two other outlaws right here, which you can see is the Tom O'Folliard and the Charlie Baldry. So we'll give a little history of that. You can see coins in here, quarters, nickels, dimes, pennies. Someone has erected some pennies here that are in the shape of a cross. Maybe someone else did it there and tried to break it up. So they've used a stick or something, I guess, to try to get it through like that. But interesting how it's all padlocked in this old jail like that. Kind of adds to some of the mystique of it, of his grave, as far as is he really here in this part of the cemetery? It's so perfectly placed almost in the center of this cemetery. On the back side of this, you can see where they have extra reinforcement with the wire cage, try to keep you from getting at it. But when you look here, you can see where people can still touch that stone, and so there's a lot of chipping on the back side of this. Billy the Kid is one of the most popular characters out of the Old West. Legend has it that Billy killed a man for every year he was alive, and he died at the age of 21. But Billy the Kid was born in New York, and his real name is Henry McCarty. His mother, Catherine, moved Billy and his brother to Wichita, Kansas. After a brush with the law, his mother was diagnosed with tuberculosis. She decided to move to New Mexico, where she remarried and died in 1874. He was arrested and thrown in jail for theft of laundry. And Billy feared for his stepfather's reaction, so he escaped jail and moved to Arizona, where he worked different odd jobs. It was there that after a scuffle he killed his first man in 1877, a blacksmith named Fred Cahill. Billy was arrested and broke out of jail once again. He then moved back to New Mexico, where he started using the alias William H Bonney. After riding with the Jesse Evans gang, he drifted into Lincoln, where he associated with a land-rich John Chisholm. John was challenging the New Mexico government beef contracts. He then became employed by Chisholm associate John Tunstall. Some rivals killed Tunstall, so Billy and several associates formed the Regulators. They tracked down and killed those responsible, including Sheriff William Rhetty. These activities were part of what was known as the Lincoln County War. Billy agreed to turn himself in when Governor Wallace promised a full pardon in exchange for testimony in several murder cases in 1879. After several months, Billy left town. Chisholm refused to pay Billy for services in the Regulators, so Billy stole some of Chisholm's livestock. 2 years later, Billy was captured, tried, and sentenced to hang for the death of Jim Carlisle in 1881. Sheriff Pat Garrett shot Billy the Kid to death after Billy escaped from prison 3 months later. What's interesting is on the back of that marker right there, you can see a .22 bullet that's a live fire. It hasn't been fired, and there's another shell up there. I think it might be a 9mm, but it's kind of hard to tell at this distance. It doesn't look too big though. But they've tucked that away right on the back side. You can see on this side there's a substantial amount of chipping on this marker as well. It's a huge marker and I can't imagine the cost of it, much less trying to ship it back from California or haul it back, all that stuff. It's a wonder that this is still around, and that's part of the debate between what was this gift shop and the townsfolk, and then obviously the other museum in town is that even the original, since it's been stolen so many times. So this middle one right here is Charlie Baldry. He died December 1880. Charlie Baldry was a member of the Regulators. He participated in the Lincoln County War and was wanted for murder in the death of Buckshot Roberts. He met with Pat Garrett to work out a surrender, but the negotiation failed and he fled from Garrett's posse. He then hid out in a shelter at Stinking Springs. The posse surrounded it during the night, and when Baldry emerged in the morning, he was shot to death. His remains were returned to his wife for burial at Fort Sumner. I'm not sure, but right there is like a hand squishy deal, one of those gel things that you squish and it comes in between the net. Here is a shell casing, and if I'm guessing, from a 22-250, something that wasn't even around in Billy the Kid's day, but yet someone left it here. I always find it interesting to see what people have left. There's all kinds of stones, coins, stuff like that. So this last one on the left side is actually Tom O'Folliard. He is buried right here. Tom O'Folliard was an American Western outlaw who was friends with Billy the Kid. He was also another member of the Regulators. He was on the road to Fort Sumner where he was shot in the chest by Sheriff Pat Garrett. One other interesting thing, right in front of this cage says the class of 1930. Pretty interesting. They've kind of etched that in there and put little pebbles inside there, and over time the pebbles have worn away. On the back side of that sign, it has Billy the Kid Points of Interest and all the little towns that he was involved in. So this is the final resting place of Lucien Bonaparte Maxwell. And you can see on this marker, it's a large one. It has an outline here of the Maxwell Grant. And then it has a few towns that are inside there. And then you can see Colorado and New Mexico to kind of get your reference of where you're at. And it even has a scale over here. 1 inch equals 4 miles. But he was a native of Illinois, a fur trader and a trapper who, by industry, good fortune, and trading, became the sole owner in 1864 of the largest single tract of land owned by any one individual in the United States. Maxwell founded the First National Bank of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and invested $250,000 to try and help build the Texas Pacific Railroad. He was dynamic, charitable, lavish, and one of the great builders of the American West. Died in quiet retirement July 25th, 1875 at Fort Sumner, New Mexico, right here where we were at. And he was born September 14th, 1818. The dotted lines are on there. It says down at the bottom, the dotted lines indicate the boundaries of the Maxwell Grant. That's a large section right there. Unbelievable. So this is the final resting place for Peter Maxwell. And I really like this one. It has the stones across the bottom there and the iron fence on top of that. Very kind of Old West feel to me. But he was born April 27th, 1848, and died July 21st, 1898. Peter Maxwell was the oldest son of Lucian Maxwell. Peter became general manager of his father's business after his death. It was Peter's bedroom where Billy the Kid was shot. Pat Garrett paid Peter a midnight visit where he asked him where the kid was. It was at this time when Billy showed up and came into the room to ask whose horses were out front. Pat immediately recognized the kid and shot him in the chest. To me, it appears that there's a substantial amount of chipping off of this one too, especially on the top. It's kind of convenient where people can reach over and do something like that. And it's on the back side as well. Seeing as this is a little elevated and it has an iron fence around it, I can't see any other way where there would be damage, just only on the top like that. Now this particular memorial marker was obviously erected later on, but this is part of all the same family here, and you can see the little markers here, which I think are part of it. And if I back up, you can see a few more stone markers here. So there's several family members here. I don't believe that they ever had any kind of names on the markers. They just simply had these stones, which is common for the time period. People just did what they had. They couldn't always afford markers. Some people didn't even want markers. Some people just had unique markers that the family knew about and no one else knew about. So there's all sorts of reasons. But take a look at some of the names on this particular memorial marker. Paulita Maxwell Jaramillo was born into one of the wealthiest families in New Mexico. Paulita became involved with Billy the Kid. His love for her is probably what kept him near Fort Sumner. Her father was Lucian Bonaparte Maxwell. Senor Jesus Silva was a friend of Billy's in Fort Sumner and was one of the many who witnessed Billy's death. He was the last man to speak to Billy before he walked into the fatal shot. Jesus was outside when he heard the shots. He rushed in, and Billy was lying on the floor, clasping a long meat cleaver in one hand and a gun in the other. He knew he was dead. Silva helped remove the body to a carpenter shop where it was dressed for burial. He built Billy's coffin and helped dig his grave. Luciano Frank Silva was raised in Fort Sumner. He was considered by many the local authority on the history of Billy the Kid. His grandfather was a pallbearer at the funeral for the kid. He loved visiting with tourists and visitors to Fort Sumner. He served in the U.S. Marines from June 19, 1944 until his honorable discharge January 2, 1946. He was wounded at Okinawa Ryukyu Islands on May 7, 1945 and received the Purple Heart. Charlie Four came to Fort Sumner with a herd of stock from Oklahoma in 1883. The stock died during the first year due to a drought. Later he was a storekeeper, hotelman, surveyor, and postmaster. He was always interested in the history of Fort Sumner, and he was the moving spirit in collecting the funds which erected a marker over the 3 graves of the outlaws. This was done so that tourists and visitors would have something to show where the graves were. His wife is Silberia Bobian Four. Her parents were Native American, but she was adopted into the household of Carlos Bobian, a famous historic trader merchant of Taos, New Mexico. This one says Joe Grant shot January 10th, 1880 by William Bonney. Now this has had a couple markers. It's actually even said Jos, as in Joseph. So I don't know if you can pick that up, but that's actually a wooden marker that's been placed there. Thick piece of wood. Right there. Just to show you the thickness of it. Pretty thick. Joseph Texas Red Grant was killed by Billy the Kid while drunk one night in Beaver Smith's saloon in Fort Sumner. Grant threatened to kill Jim Chisholm, whom Billy was sitting with, thinking it was John Chisholm. Billy corrected him, and Grant shouted that he was lying. Billy turned his back to Grant, at which time Grant fired at Billy's back. What he didn't know earlier is that Billy had asked to see his gun, and he had spun the barrel around to an empty chamber, anticipating something like that would happen. When Billy heard the click of an empty chamber, he spun around and shot him. That's going to do it for today. I appreciate you guys watching. If you like videos like this, please give this a thumbs up and check out the other videos on lawmen and outlaws. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you guys next time.